The chains made no sound as they moved. That was the first lesson: how to walk without rattling the iron, how to disappear while standing in plain sight, how to survive in a world where you were property, not a person. In the shadow of marble columns and golden laurels, beneath the grandeur of the greatest empire the world had ever seen, millions lived and died as slaves. This is their story, the one Rome never wanted told. Picture the morning sun rising over the Tiber River in the year 73 BCE. The city awakens in layers. First, the slaves, always the slaves, emerging from cramped quarters beneath wealthy homes, from workshops where they slept chained to their workbenches, from rural estates where they huddled in stone barracks that offered little protection from winter's bite. They moved through Rome's streets before dawn, carrying water from public fountains, sweeping the steps of temples, preparing the bathhouses, lighting the ovens in bakeries. By the time their masters stirred from silk-covered beds, an entire invisible army had already been working for hours. Rome's prosperity was built on their backs. Conservative estimates suggest that at the height of the empire, between 1/4 and 1/3 of Italy's population existed in bondage, perhaps 2 to 3 million souls in chains. In Rome itself, the proportion was even higher. Some historians believe that slaves may have outnumbered free citizens in the capital. They were everywhere and nowhere, essential yet unseen, the foundation upon which the marble dream of eternal Rome was constructed. But how does a person become property? The mechanisms of slavery in Rome were as varied as they were cruel. War fed the system like a great river feeding the sea. When Roman legions conquered new territories, captives were marched back in chains, entire populations transformed into commodities overnight. After the Third Punic War, 50,000 Carthaginians were enslaved in a single day. When Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, he enslaved hundreds of thousands, sending them south in endless columns that stretched across the horizon. These people, warriors, farmers, mothers, children, woke one morning as free citizens of their homelands and went to sleep that night as Roman property. Piracy provided another stream of human cargo. The Mediterranean Sea, which Romans called Mare Nostrum Arsi, was infested with slave traders who raided coastal villages. They came at night, torches blazing, and took whoever they could catch. A fisherman mending his nets might find himself on an auction block in Delos within a week, sold to the highest bidder, his old life erased as if it had never existed. The island of Delos became the greatest slave market in the ancient world, capable of processing 10,000 slaves in a single day during peak periods. Then there were those born into slavery. The child of a slave mother inherited her status, regardless of the father's identity. These children knew no other life. They were raised in the households of their masters, sometimes treated with a twisted form of affection, sometimes brutalized from their earliest memories. They learned from infancy to read the moods of free people. The way a sailor reads the wind's survival depended on it. Debt slavery provided yet another avenue into bondage. A farmer who borrowed money and couldn't repay might sell himself or his children to satisfy creditors. A father facing starvation could choose to sell a daughter rather than watch her die slowly of hunger. These were the cruel mathematics of the ancient world, where poverty was a trapdoor that could open beneath anyone's feet. The slave markets of Rome operated with businesslike efficiency. In the forum and throughout the city, human beings stood on raised platforms, while potential buyers examined them like livestock. They were stripped naked, so purchasers could check for physical defects, scars that might indicate a history of escape attempts or rebellion, signs of disease or weakness. Slaves were often made to jump and move to demonstrate their strength and agility. Their teeth were inspected like those of horses. Some traders hung placards around their necks, listing their skills, their origin, their temperament. A Greek-educated slave might fetch an enormous price as a tutor or secretary. A strong young man from Germania could be purchased for hard labor in the mines or on a latifundium, the vast agricultural estates that, sprawled across the Italian countryside. The experience of slavery varied wildly, depending on where fate deposited you. An educated Greek slave purchased by a wealthy senator might live in relative comfort, managing his master's affairs, tutoring his children, even accumulating savings with the eventual possibility of purchasing freedom. Such slaves ate well, lived in the master's house, and exercised a certain degree of autonomy. Some became trusted advisors, confidants who knew their master's deepest secrets. But this was the aristocracy of slavery, a tiny minority. At the opposite extreme were those condemned to the mines. The silver mines of Spain, the gold mines of Desha, these were death sentences delivered slowly. Slaves descended into darkness each morning, chained together, and spent their days in cramped tunnels where the air was thick with dust and the risk of collapse was constant. They worked by the light of oil lamps, their bodies bent and broken by the weight of ore baskets, their lungs gradually filling with rock dust. Few survived more than a few years. Mine slaves were considered so disposable that they weren't even given names in the records, just numbers. When one died, another took his place. Agricultural slaves formed the backbone of Rome's food supply. On the latifundia, vast estates that specialized in olive oil, wine, and grain. Slaves worked in chain gangs supervised by overseers, who were often freed slaves themselves, men who had earned their liberty and now ensured the bondage of others. These agricultural workers lived in barracks called ergastula, stone buildings where they were locked each night. During harvest season, they worked from dawn until they could no longer see their hands in front of their faces. The Roman agricultural writer Columella advised landowners to inspect their slaves' quarters regularly to ensure they remained properly chained. This was efficiency, Roman style. Urban slaves faced different challenges. Household slaves, the majority in the city, performed every conceivable task. There were doorkeepers who stood at the entrance of wealthy homes, announcing visitors. There were litter bearers who carried their masters through the streets in elaborate chairs. There were cooks, cleaners, hairdressers, and beauticians. Wealthy Roman women might own dozens of slaves whose sole purpose was to maintain their appearance. One slave would manage the wardrobe, another would specialize in hairstyling, another in cosmetics, another in jewelry. The wealthy competed to display the largest and most specialized slave staffs. It became fashionable to own slaves who performed absurdly specific tasks. One might have a slave whose only job was to remember names, another who existed solely to tell jokes at dinner parties, another who did nothing but apply perfume. This wasn't just about functionality. It was about status. Your worth in Roman society could be measured by how many people you owned. But within the system of urban slavery, there existed hierarchies and strategies for survival. Clever slaves learned to make themselves indispensable. A talented cook became too valuable to sell or abuse severely. A skilled secretary who managed his master's accounts held knowledge that gave him a sliver of power. An educated pedagogue who tutored the master's children might develop relationships that offered protection. These slaves walked a constant tightrope, balancing subservience with competence, finding ways to carve out small spaces of autonomy within their captivity. The peculiar institution, Rome's own complicated term for what we might call domestic slavery, created relationships that defied simple categorization. Some slaves developed genuine affection for their master's children, whom they raised from infancy. Some masters, in turn, showed preference for certain slaves, elevating them to positions of trust, consulting them on important matters, even relying on them for emotional support. But sentiment never erased the fundamental reality. The master owned the slave absolutely and could sell, torture, or kill them at any moment. Roman law regarding slaves was brutally clear. A slave was a race, a thing, not a persona, a person. They could own no property. Anything they accumulated belonged to their master. They could not legally marry, though they formed relationships and families that existed in a gray zone of unofficial recognition. Their children could be sold away at any moment. They had no right to refuse their master's sexual demands. A master who killed his own slave faced no punishment until relatively late in the empire, when reforms introduced some minimal protections, though even these were rarely enforced. The sexual exploitation of slaves was endemic and unremarked. Masters used their slaves' bodies as they pleased, and this was considered a natural exercise of property rights. Slave women were particularly vulnerable, subjected to the desires of masters, their sons, their guests, and overseers. The children born of these unions swelled the slave population, creating a perpetual underclass. Some masters freed their own children born to slave mothers. Others sold them without acknowledgement. The system had no conscience. Yet within this world of chains and subjugation, resistance flickered like flame. It took many forms, from the subtle to the spectacular. The most common resistance was simply doing poor work breaking tools accidentally, losing items, preparing food badly, moving slowly. Romans complained endlessly about lazy, incompetent slaves, never acknowledging that perfect service from the powerless was a contradiction in terms. Why would someone work hard when all the fruits of their labor went to their oppressor? Escape was always on the minds of the enslaved. Some ran at every opportunity, fleeing to the forests and mountains where they tried to survive as fugitives. Recaptured runaways were often branded on the forehead with the letter F for fugitivus, a permanent mark of their attempted freedom. Some were forced to wear heavy metal collars engraved with messages like, "I have run away, catch me," along with the master's address and a promise of reward for their return. These collars had been discovered by archaeologists, silent testimony to desperate bids for freedom. Others chose a different form of escape death by their own hand. Suicide was common enough among slaves that owners took precautions to prevent it. Newly purchased slaves were watched carefully for signs of despair. The philosopher Seneca recorded the story of a German slave who, rather than face the arena, killed himself by shoving the wooden stick used to wipe oneself after defecating down his own throat. The message was clear: death was preferable to slavery. But the most spectacular resistance came in the form of rebellion, and no rebellion haunted Rome's nightmares more than the uprising led by Spartacus. In 73 BCE, a Thracian gladiator named Spartacus and about 70 of his fellow fighters escaped from a gladiatorial training school in Capua. They broke free using kitchen implements, overwhelmed their guards, and fled to the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. Rome expected this to be a minor incident, easily suppressed. Rome was catastrophically wrong. Spartacus proved to be a military genius. As word of the rebellion spread, slaves from the surrounding countryside flocked to join him. The rebel army grew from dozens to hundreds to thousands. They defeated the first Roman forces sent against them, then the second, capturing weapons and armor from the fallen legionaries. With each victory, more joined the cause. At its peak, Spartacus commanded an army estimated between 70,000 and 120,000 people, the largest slave rebellion in Roman history. For 2 years, Spartacus and his followers defeated Roman army after Roman army. They ranged up and down the Italian peninsula, freeing slaves from estates, raiding cities, living as free people in the heart of the empire that had enslaved them. For the enslaved population throughout Italy, they represented possibility, the radical notion that the system could be challenged, that chains could be broken. But Spartacus faced an impossible strategic situation. His followers had different goals. Some wanted to escape Italy entirely, to return to their homelands across the Alps or across the seas. Others wanted to continue the war against Rome, to burn down the system that had burned them. Spartacus reportedly tried to lead his people north to freedom, but many refused to leave. They had found power for the first time in their lives, and they weren't ready to relinquish it. Rome, terrified by the specter of slave revolution, eventually assigned the task of destroying Spartacus to Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in the world. Crassus raised new legions and instituted brutal discipline, even reviving the ancient punishment of decimation, executing 1 in every 10 soldiers in units that showed cowardice. Slowly, methodically, he cornered the slave army in southern Italy. The final battle came in 71 BCE. Spartacus's army fought with ferocious desperation. They knew no mercy awaited them in defeat. Ancient sources claim Spartacus tried to fight his way to Crassus himself, seeking to kill the Roman general in single combat, but he was cut down in the chaos of battle. His body was never identified among the thousands of dead. What happens when an empire built on the backs of slaves finally crumbles? For centuries, the Roman Empire was a machine powered by human beings. Millions of people, captured in war, born into bondage, or sold for debt, were the engine of its economy, its agriculture, its homes, and even its entertainment. But what happened to all these people when the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD? Did they all just walk free one day? The story is a lot more complicated, and honestly, a lot more interesting than that. Let us get one thing straight. There wasn't a single day where someone blew a whistle and announced, "Slavery's over. Everyone go home." The end of Roman slavery wasn't an event. It was a slow, messy, and incredibly long process that unfolded over centuries. It was less like flipping a switch and more like a dimmer dial being slowly, almost imperceptibly, turned down. First, let's look at the final years of the Western Empire. Things were chaotic. Barbarian invasions, political instability, and economic collapse were the headlines of the day. This chaos actually started changing the nature of slavery itself. Big agricultural estates, called latifundia, which used to be run by huge gangs of slaves, were becoming less efficient. It was expensive to feed, house, and guard so many people, especially when trade routes were constantly being disrupted. So, landowners started to shift their strategy. Instead of working slaves in chain gangs, they began to settle them on small plots of land. These people were known as coloni. A colonist wasn't exactly a slave, but they weren't free either. They were tenant farmers tied to the land. They had to give a large portion of their harvest to the landowner and couldn't leave without permission. Think of it as a step up from chattel slavery, where you are literal property, but it's far from freedom. Your kids would inherit your status, tied to the same plot of land. This system, called the colonate, laid the groundwork for what would later become serfdom in the Middle Ages. So, as the empire was collapsing, many slaves were transitioning into this new form of bondage. It offered a tiny bit more autonomy. You had your own family, your own little hut, but your life was still fundamentally controlled by someone else. Then, the Western Empire officially falls. The Germanic tribes, the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks take over. Now, you might think these new rulers would just abolish the whole system. Not quite. These societies had their own forms of slavery, often based on warfare or debt. But their approach was generally less industrialized than Rome's. They didn't have a constant, massive influx of captives from expansionist wars like the Roman Republic did. What happened was a kind of fusion. Roman legal traditions and social structures didn't just vanish. They blended with the customs of the new Germanic rulers. The institution of slavery continued, but it changed. The massive slave markets of Rome disappeared. The scale of slavery was reduced. Instead of huge plantations, you were more likely to find slaves working within a household or on a smaller farm, often alongside free laborers and serfs. This brings us to a really important factor: religion. The rise of Christianity played a huge, and somewhat contradictory, role in the decline of slavery. Early on, Christianity didn't outright condemn slavery. The New Testament has passages that advise slaves. Early Christian leaders were more focused on the spiritual state of a person as soul than their social status. A slave could be a good Christian, and a master could be a good Christian. However, as Christianity became the dominant religion of the late Roman Empire and the early Middle Ages, its ideas started to chip away at the foundations of slavery. The church taught that all people were equal in the eyes of God. This made it increasingly uncomfortable to justify owning another Christian as mere property. The church began to encourage manumission, the act of freeing a slave, as a pious and charitable act. Many wealthy Romans on their deathbeds would free their slaves in their wills, hoping to earn favor with God. The church also began to legislate against the enslavement of fellow Christians. While it was still considered acceptable to enslave pagans or captives from non-Christian lands, a kind of in-group protection started to develop. Popes and bishops issued decrees discouraging the selling of Christians to non-Christians. This gradually limited the supply of people who could be legally enslaved within Christian Europe. So you have this moral pressure from the church, combined with the economic shift away from giant slave-run estates. The old Roman-style chattel slavery was slowly being squeezed out of existence. It was being replaced by serfdom. A serf was bound to the land and owed labor and goods to a lord, but they couldn't be bought and sold as an individual piece of property. They had certain rights, however limited. It was a brutal and oppressive system, don't get me wrong, but it was legally distinct from the chattel slavery of ancient Rome. By around the year 1000, traditional slavery had become pretty rare in most of Western Europe. It had been almost completely replaced by the feudal system of lords and serfs. A peasant in the year 1100 had a miserable life by our standards, but it was a different kind of misery than that of a slave in a Roman mine in 100 AD. But here, that's the crucial part of the story we can't forget. Slavery didn't truly end. It just went elsewhere. While it faded in Western Europe, the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, continued many Roman traditions, including slavery, for centuries longer. Their capital, Constantinople, remained a major hub for slave trading. And more significantly, the concept never died. Europeans may have stopped enslaving each other for the most part, but the idea that it was acceptable to enslave outsiders, people of different religions or ethnicities, persisted. This is the dark seed that would sprout centuries later into the transatlantic slave trade. When European explorers and colonizers encountered people in Africa and the Americas, they resurrected and repurposed old justifications for enslavement. They argued that these people were heathens or uncivilized, using logic eerily similar to what Romans used for barbarians. So, the aftermath of Roman slavery is a story of gradual transformation, not abolition. It morphed from the industrial-scale chattel slavery of the empire into the feudal bondage of serfdom. This change was driven by a perfect storm of economic collapse, political chaos, and the slow, grinding influence of new religious ideas. But the ghost of Roman slavery haunted Europe. The legal frameworks, the social justifications, and the sheer memory of a society built on human property never fully went away. They lay dormant, waiting for a new context, a new opportunity, to re-emerge in a new and even more horrific form. The fall of Rome didn't end slavery. It just marked the end of one chapter and, tragically, set the stage for the next. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this deep dive into history interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more. It really helps the channel out. See you in the next one. Slaves helped each other in small ways that the historical record rarely captures. They shared food when rations were short. They covered for each other when someone was sick or injured. They passed warnings about the master's moods or the arrival of inspectors. They comforted each other through losses, celebrated small joys together, formed families and friendships that gave meaning to lives that the law said had no value. And they found moments of something approaching joy. Festival days when masters traditionally relaxed discipline, allowing slaves to celebrate with extra food and wine. The Saturnalia, Rome's great winter festival, supposedly reversed normal hierarchies. with masters serving their slaves for a day, though this was more theater than genuine liberation. Musical performances, storytelling, gambling, love affairs, human beings, finding ways to be human, even in human circumstances. The gladiatorial arena, that most famous symbol of Roman entertainment, was intimately connected to slavery. Most gladiators were slaves or condemned criminals, forced to fight for the amusement of crowds. They trained in gladiatorial schools, learning to kill efficiently and die entertainingly. The best could earn fame and even freedom, but most died young, buried in mass graves outside the city. The arena was slavery distilled to its purest essence. Human beings as spectacle, their suffering as entertainment, their deaths as sport. Yet even in the arena, resistance flickered. Some gladiators refused to fight. Others turned their weapons on their captors rather than each other. A few, like Spartacus, escaped and kindled rebellion. The arena could not fully suppress the human desire for dignity, for self-determination, for freedom. As the Roman Empire evolved from republic to autocracy, the slave system evolved with it. The great conquests that had fed the slave markets gradually ceased. Rome's borders stabilized, and the supply of war captives diminished. The price of slaves rose. Landowners began experimenting with different labor systems, settling slaves on plots of land as quasi-peasants who owed labor and rent, a system that anticipated medieval serfdom. Christianity's rise complicated matters further. As the empire officially converted, Christian emperors issued reforms that technically improved slave conditions, prohibiting the breakup of slave families, limiting punishment, encouraging manumission. But these reforms were often ignored in practice, and church leaders developed theological justifications for slavery that would persist for over 1,000 years. The fundamental institution remained intact, its evils rationalized and spiritualized. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century did not end slavery. It transformed. The slave markets of the ancient world gave way to new forms of bonded labor. Slavery persisted in different forms across Europe, the Mediterranean, and beyond. The Roman legal framework for treating human beings as property would influence slave codes around the world, from medieval Europe to the colonial Americas. But in that long night of bondage, in those centuries when millions lived and died in chains, countless individuals refused to let their humanity be stolen. They remembered who they had been. They loved and were loved. They resisted in ways large and small. They survived, and their descendants survived, carrying forward the knowledge that no system of oppression, no matter how powerful, can completely extinguish the human spirit. We know the names of emperors and generals, of senators and poets, of the free men who shaped the visible history of Rome. We know almost none of the names of the slaves who built their cities, who farmed their fields, who raised their children, who made their civilization possible. Their stories were not written down because their lives were not considered worth recording. They were expected to suffer in silence and vanish without trace. But they lived. They struggled. They endured. And in the rare moments when we glimpse them through the historical record, in a tombstone's inscription, in a manumission document, in the archaeological evidence of cramped slave quarters and iron shackles, we see reflections of ourselves. People who wanted what all people want: freedom, dignity, love, the chance to make choices about their own lives. The hidden world of Roman slaves reminds us of both the worst and best of human nature, the capacity for cruelty that can construct entire civilizations on suffering, and the resilience that allows the human spirit to survive and resist even in history's darkest corners. In the end, Rome's marble and glory have crumbled, but the struggle of its slaves against their chains echoes still, a reminder that the hunger for freedom is as old as oppression itself, and that no chain, no matter how heavy, can forever bind the human soul.